Hello, and welcome to the latest installment of UniverCities Exchange. This is an ongoing collaborative project between UMKC and UMSL that gathers community leadership alongside academic expertise to discuss problems and possible solutions to issues affecting the Kansas City and St. Louis metro areas. I'm Sarah Fensky. I'm the host of St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio. And today we're going to discuss an issue affecting cities all across the country: urban abandonment and vacancy. Community leaders have been working hard to combat this problem. And today we've gathered some of the leading voices in both Kansas City and St. Louis to discuss what is being done in the Missouri urban centers. And so joining us today is an expert panel of guests. That includes Nyla Mbiti. She is the Chief Real Estate Development Officer for the Ivanhoe Neighborhood Council in Kansas City. And we are also joined by Peter Hoffman. He is the Managing Attorney for Legal Services of Eastern Missouri's Neighborhood Vacancy Initiative. Welcome, Peter. And we're joined by Brent Never. He is an Associate Professor of Public Affairs at the Block School of Management at UMKC. Welcome, Brent. And we're joined by Sundi Whiteside. She is the Board President of the St. Louis Association of Community Organizations, better known as SLACO. Welcome, Sundi. And we're also joined today by Jeff Jolly. He's the Executive Director of LISC Greater Kansas City, and that is the KC chapter of Local Initiative Support Corporation, again, better known as LISC. Welcome, Jeff. And we are joined by Ruben Alonzo. He is the President of AltCap in Kansas City. And last but not least, we are joined today by Neil Richardson. He is the Vice President and Director of Business Impact Group at US Bank and the President of Dream Builders for Equity here in St. Louis. Neil, welcome. And thank you all for joining us today. We do want to encourage you, as questions come up in your mind as we have this discussion, you are welcome to post them here in the Q&A feature. After our discussion today, we've allotted a sizable amount of time for your questions. We're happy to take those. Just post those there in the Q&A, and we will get to them when we get to that part of the conversation. But first, I want to start today's conversation with some context. And let's start with St. Louis, because St. Louis has been dealing with these issues of urban abandonment and vacancy for a long time. I want to start here with Sundi Whiteside. Sundi, how big a problem are vacancies in St. Louis?
Oh, well, thank you. I want to give first thanks to Katie, Nate, Troy, and Carl for helping to form this event, and to you, Sarah, for putting this format together. Without you, I don't know what we do. But how big is this problem in St. Louis City? So St. Louis City has the third highest vacant property rate in the country. We have approximately 2,500 acres of vacant properties. And that equates to over 20,000 vacant parcels. Vacant lots are a little over 12,500, while vacant buildings number around 7,700. And we have a land bank, the Land Reutilization Authority, better known as LRA. And LRA owns approximately 9,000 vacant lots and about 3,000 vacant buildings. So in vacant buildings, 60% of them are privately owned in St. Louis, and 40% LRA owned. But vacant buildings make up 40% of the fires in our city. About 65% of the African American population live in high concentrations of vacancy versus only 19% of Caucasians. And there's a greater impact of these high concentrations of vacancy. They've created lower property values, higher rates of drug and gun crimes, and illegal dumping, poorer environmental health, and lower quality of life, and really a lost sense of community pride. So the vacancy challenges, it's all connected to everything: our crime, our poverty, our housing cost burden, lead poisoning, asthma, lack of internet access, and of course, illegal dumping.
So this is a huge problem. And this question I'm about to ask you next, Sundi, the answer could well be a book, but I'm going to ask you for the very short version of this. What do you see as some of the origins of this problem here in St. Louis?
Well, I think over the continuum, it has really been plagued by it stems from years of redlining and segregation, institutionalized racism, white flight, and then industry collapsing, then Black flight, and then total disinvestment, and with this hopeless triage approach.
Okay, so these are some big problems, and thank you for summarizing that history there so succinctly. Jeff, I want to turn this to you for some Kansas City perspective on this. Sundie gave us some numbers in St. Louis. How big a problem is this in Kansas City?
Thank you, Sarah. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a huge problem in Kansas City as well as it is in most urban centers across the country. So we've seen data as ranging from 10 to 15% of households roughly in the community are vacant. Depends on what kind of whether you include properties that are in the midst of sale by ownership or rent. Anywhere from 10 to 12,000 in a report I saw from the Federal Reserve a few years ago, to as much as the census estimates close to 30,000 units being vacant when all are counted. So it's a huge problem in the Kansas City area as well as St. Louis.
And would you say the roots of the problems in Kansas City are similar to what Sundie outlined for St. Louis? Do you see any big differences?
Yeah, I think for many people who are familiar with Kansas City, they think of Troost as this dividing line in our community between East and West, between Black and white, and they don't look back at some of the historical issues that took place that led to that dividing line, which were really, and I know some of our panelists will likely cover this, but redlining, racial covenants that contributed intentional disinvestment in parts of the community that we still see the effects today. If you look at a heat map really of the Kansas City metropolitan area on where vacant properties are, what you'll see is them roughly within 10 blocks on either side of the Bruce R. Watkins, and then significant number in the core of the city and along I-70. So some correlation between where historically highways and infrastructure went in, cutting through Black communities. We see the results today in these vacant structures.
And Jeff, did that abandonment that Kansas City is now dealing with, did that happen in roughly the same time frame as it was happening in St. Louis?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, we've gone back to the late 1800s really to trace some of the property acquisition and some of the policies that took place even before World War I that led to the effects that we see today. I will say LISC was proud to work on the land bank legislation for Kansas City. St. Louis led the way in land banks, really one of the first ones formed in the early 1970s, whereas in Kansas City, we didn't get ours set up and structured really until about 2010. So we're a little bit behind on some of the approaches to address the issue. But I would say the timeline for the creation of the problem would be similar.
Peter, I'm hoping you can bring us some insight into the demographics and some of the things we know about the neighborhoods most affected by these vacant homes. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, thank you for having me. I think Sundie and Jeff summarized it really well. The same neighborhoods that suffer from disinvestment and high vacancy rates are also the same neighborhoods with the highest poverty rates, the highest crime rates, the highest housing cost burden, lack of internet access, illegal dumping, lead poisoning, you name it. We kind of have a saying here in St. Louis, it's the same map. So if you're looking at a map of all of those statistics, and then you look at the map for vacancy rates, it's the same map. This issue, it just overlaps with all of those other issues. And maybe it's no surprise that this most impacts communities of color. So the neighborhoods with the highest vacancy rates are overwhelmingly comprised of African-American residents, and they're also the lowest income neighborhoods in our community. So I think St. Louis and Kansas City really share that unfortunate distinction.
Nyla, I'd love to turn to you for more of an on-the-ground view of this. What are some of the problems that vacant homes bring to a neighborhood?
Thank you for having me on the panel. As has already been mentioned, the vacant houses attract a lot of crime, but I want to sort of focus on the things that haven't been mentioned. The fact that when you live on a block with several vacant houses, there is a sense of insecurity because of the fact that there are not eyes on the street. So it can be perceived as being very unsafe. The other thing that happens is that there's illegal occupancy by people who generally are homeless, but not just homeless as a homeless family, but people who may have either alcoholism, substance abuse, or mental illness issues. The other thing that happens is neighborhoods with a lot of vacant homes also become very disconnected in terms of the residents with one another, especially if you're on a block where there may only be 3 houses that actually have people who live in the house. So it creates not only just the physical problems that have already been discussed, but also those emotional and mental barriers that prevent people from actually living and thriving in a community.
Sunday, I saw you nodding a bit while Nyla was talking. Are those similar impacts that you've observed in St. Louis neighborhoods?
Most definitely. I think St. Louis, sometimes I think we are leading in a lot of issues, but recent studies are showing that a lot of the crime, and in particular the violent gun violence, is attributed to some vacancy issues. And a lot of our vacant lots pose a threat to citizens because they are able to produce lots of crime within 150 feet of most of our vacant lots. So, but I would agree with what Naylor is saying and wholeheartedly that those same types of problems related to everything with the lead poisoning potentially leading to some type of mental health conditions and other mental health conditions that are posed by this. And our blocks are really eaten away. And as she said, we have a lot of blocks that maybe have 3 homes that are occupied, but a lot of the homes are vacant, and a lot of them have been vacant for decades. So they are so deteriorated that they not only give a perceived sense of unsafetyness, they are actually creating an unsafe environment.
Now, I think a lot of people probably assume that the biggest thing that needs to happen to solve the vacant house problem is just to get somebody to buy one of these houses. And I know it's not always that simple. Brent, you have learned that that just isn't always the case. Why is it not as simple as it seems like it would be?
Sure, Sarah. Yeah, I think a lot of us exist in a world where real estate is something, an agent, you go on Zillow or whatever site you go on and you find that dream home. What we find is it is very complicated. So as Jeff had mentioned, here in Kansas City, our land bank is about 10 years old, 10, 11 years old. Land bank houses are one way that we try to move properties from being vacant and abandoned to being filled with families, adding to neighborhoods. A couple major issues. One is what's called a clouded title. So just a really quick example. Your family grew up in a house, grandma is in the house now and she passes away or she goes into a nursing facility. Your family has the house, maybe the transfer with the family members wasn't so clear. All of a sudden you have a clouded title, meaning it's not so clear who owns that house, who's in custody. And a large percentage of our houses that are vacant and abandoned are that because of this clouded title problem. So it's a legal problem. It's not that people don't see value in that house or value in that neighborhood. So we really struggle in Kansas City. People such as Peter Hoffman have been very helpful in the past in helping people with this idea of a clouded title. But also, let me just say, when houses come out of the land bank, you can buy them for at $1 sale. Can you imagine buying a house for $1 or $999 sale? What we were finding, though, is you have a fixed period of time to bring that house up to code. And what was happening was a lot of families would buy one of these houses thinking, this is my way to put in the sweat equity to have a great house in which to live or to have a property where I can get on that income ladder. A lot of immigrant families, in fact, were finding that they couldn't bring it up to code. It would become this sort of weight around them as a family. The land bank would have to take it back, and then some very savvy flippers could come in, buy that house with all that sweat equity already in it, bring it up to code by paying for the relevant inspections, and then they have that asset. So it's really troubling how this can go down.
Peter, I'd love for you to speak to this as the legal expert here today. What are some of the legal challenges you've seen that Brent alluded to some, but some that come along with getting these houses purchased and getting them up to code?
Yeah, well, I think Brent's comment is spot on. And that's really one of the biggest issues we have is with these fractured land titles that are really the result of people not having access to all the benefits of a functional housing market. So like Brent said, you know, the access to the realtors and the mortgage companies and the title companies and, you know, the local law office that really helps ensure that that title is transferred cleanly and that lending can take place. Those are all absent when you've got decades and decades of disinvestment. But the other issue that I think is a pretty major legal hurdle is increasingly there's this kind of complex nature of real estate ownership in America. And I'm talking about like LLCs, shell corporations. Really, since the Great Recession, the numbers of these paper entities have really dramatically increased. And so these entities, they give so much protection to their creators that it's really almost impossible sometimes to know who's the true owner, who's accountable for that property in any meaningful way. So, you know, Shell Company, LLC out of California isn't coming to municipal housing court. They're not paying their fines. You can't throw them in jail. And really, what is a city to do? It really presents a huge challenge for cities and neighborhoods who want to solve the problems associated with vacant and abandoned properties. So I would just say that's probably another major hurdle we have to overcome is trying to figure out a way to get at who's really in control of these properties so that they can be held accountable.
Well, our panelists have done a great job today in explaining the magnitude of this problem and just how many challenges surround it. I want to talk now about some solutions because most of the people who are here today are here because they're working towards solutions. And Sundi, again, let's start this with you. What is the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative doing to take on some of these problems that we've talked about here today?
Okay, so this gives me a great opportunity to tell everybody about the St. Louis Vacancy Collaborative and what it is. It is a coalition of community members, private and nonprofit stakeholders, and city departments and agencies committed to reducing vacant property in St. Louis. Our guiding principles that are the foundation of our approach to addressing vacancy are collaborative, transparent, data-driven, community-informed, policy and systems-oriented, and a racial equity framework. What truly makes us different is we are not the traditional task force or partnership that the leadership forms and then appoints selected community leaders or selected residents for participation in, while giving maybe an update and receiving community input once or twice a year, maybe. This coalition and collaborative allows continuous community and resident input and inclusion. So now we have over 40 plus organizations participating. We have 12 city departments also participating, hundreds of individual volunteers and residents. We have 6 working groups that meet monthly, and any resident is allowed a seat at the table and can participate. Our 6 working groups are our anti-displacement working group focused on equitable development, preventing displacement. Our data analysis working group, which is helping us increase transparency and tracking. Our marketing and engagement group, our reinvestment and reuse group, our stabilization, maintenance, and demolition working group, and our vacancy prevention group, which is honorably chaired by Peter Hoffman. And they focus on how to prevent a property from becoming vacant in the first place. We've asked all of our working groups that I just described and pertinent city departments to prioritize actions that were emerging in their deliberations, and they created an 18-month strategic plan. We call it our work plan. This helps us in pulling all of the groups together into a shared mission and a strategic set of action items to accomplish. The work plan minimizes conflict and overlap while it maximizes teamwork and synergy. It can be viewed at our website, which is located at www.stlvacancy.com. And here are some of the examples of what the Vacancy Collaborative is doing. We're advocating for policy and program changes, including state legislation that passed in 2019, Senate Bill 203. The legislation provides neighborhood groups and residents with more tools to address the problems associated with vacant properties. That charge was led by Peter Hoffman. Conducting workshops and educational experiences with all of our partners. How to reinvest in vacant properties, some of the training. How to navigate the tax sale. Landlord and rehabber training, home owner education are some of the things that we offer. We also are looking at more equitable ways to do code enforcement. And also we have created guides to help people take action, legal tools for private buildings, reuse of vacant lots. And these guides can also be found on our website. We've also created several data tools that are on our website that help us with tracking and transparency. Our vacant properties portal is where you can get a lot of statistical data and information on vacant properties. The property data is critical to us defining our vacancy landscape and property ownership. And it also aids in our planning and tracking, as I stated, but most importantly, the transparency piece. We have a demo tracker on our website where you can track vacant property demolitions from the stages of under review, coming soon, in progress, completed demolitions, and you can get information on when and who performed the various demolitions. We also have a community organizations map. It allows an individual to click on any neighborhood on the map and see a listing of the various neighborhood associations, groups and organizations within that neighborhood. And it also provides meeting dates, contact information, leadership structure of the organization, and their legal boundaries are listed for that group.
Wow, well, that is a lot right there. I know one specific thing that you've also been working on as a part of this and in your work at SLACO is helping to find and recruit the right buyers for these homes. Can you tell us a bit about the Finest 15 program?
Yes, so we have two phenomenal SLACO members that are also serving on the Vacancy Collaborative as well. But Angela Drake and Torian Hawkins created SLACO's Finest 15 program. And it's a series of neighborhood workshops highlighting the 15 best publicly owned properties owned by our land bank LRA. And they spotlight the ones in that neighborhood and they educate residents on how to purchase, finance, and rehab those properties, resulting in the sale of over 30 LRA properties in one neighborhood and more throughout the city of St. Louis.
I think that's a great transition to bringing Neil into the conversation. Neil, you're also working on getting these homes habitable and to the right buyers.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about the work you're doing with that?
Yeah, for sure. So I have the privilege of leading Dream Builders for Equity, and our mission is really transforming Black communities with the minority contractors and the youth who live there. By investing in the revitalization of real estate in these communities, we provide pathways to home ownership, improve the quality of homes for existing residents, and create safer places for people to socialize, learn, and play, ultimately increasing the demand for subsequent investments from the private and public sector. Our goal and our aim is to really build economically sustainable and socially engaged Black communities. By doing that with the youth, the residents, the businesses, and overall the real estate revitalization in those communities. A unique feature of our program is we work with organizations like the Legal Services of Eastern Missouri and the Hyde Park Neighborhood Association to identify properties that have been nuisances to that community. Many of my previous panelists have spoke to the vacancies and the crimes that are created and the gaps that are created by many of the vacancies that are in these different communities. And so what we aim to do is take those nuisance properties off of the market, bring forth a vibrant community, vibrant resources in which the community can be very proud of. And so what we do, again, is engage with the neighborhood associations in which we're working in. And then we work to identify those properties and rebuild them with the youth that live there. Ultimately, this creates the inventory for home buyers to have a safe place that they feel confident was constructed for them and that created for them to be engaged. Our students also have a sense of ownership in their property as they're earning equity in the real estate that we're developing in partnership with the minority contractors in which we're hiring. So as we bring these vacant properties that, as many people have spoke to, have been sitting vacant for generations back onto the market, it is going to be creating housing stock that is safe and affordable for the communities to begin to start rebuild and transform.
Well, that's some great news, some great stuff going underway in St. Louis. Let's get the Kansas City perspective on this question. Jeff, what are some of the pieces of the effort that is underway these days in Kansas City?
Thank you. I'm excited to hear about Sunday and Neil's work, though. It's informative for us as well. I will say there's a number of various initiatives. I think one thing that I would mention, we've talked a lot about some of the crime and educational health impacts of these vacant lots, abandoned structures. I also want to just remind everyone that there's a financial impact. So we see in communities of color, often Black families have 10 times less net worth than the average white family. Much of that, the net worth is transferred through home ownership. That's been one way Americans have historically been able to garner wealth and transfer it from generation to generation. So as we've had this kind of historical disinvestment, particularly in our communities of color, we have pulled that wealth and assets out of the Black community. And so we must be intentional in kind of reinvesting and being sure that we're providing opportunities in those same communities for people to then build that wealth. And so in Kansas City, some of the focus areas have been around cooperative models, exploring various different cooperative models. Ruben may touch on one that I think AltCap is working on, but community land trusts and other neighborhood trusts. Another issue we have is similar to Peter's effort. Legal Services has been helping with clearing title around properties that have gotten entangled. We also have a Vacant to Vibrant effort that one of our partners, the Urban Neighborhood Initiative, has led alongside NILA and Ivanhoe Neighborhood Council and others. So I would say we're attempting different approaches. There's a significant amount of investment in kind of home ownership training. LISC supports 5 financial opportunity centers where we do financial coaching one-on-one to help put people in a position where they might be able to buy or rent or certainly at least increase their economic assets and capabilities. So there's some of the work that we're trying to do in Kansas City alongside a number of good partners.
So Jeff just mentioned Ruben's work there. Ruben, I'd love to hear more about these cooperative models that you're working on at AltCap. And I think you're muted. If you can unmute yourself.
Thank you. As a CDFI, a community development financial institution, our role is to bring resources and capital to communities that, have essentially been shut out of the financial mainstream. So while AltCap is very much focused on small businesses, we did see ourselves as having a role in supporting, how do we, address this abandoned vacant home issue in our urban core. So we approached it by trying to provide capital to contractors who can go in, small contractors can go in and rehab these homes, providing them accessible patient capital with legal aid to provide free legal services to those small contractors. If they're dealing with a home that has cloudy title issues, they can have that resource to be able to address that issue. So that's one way we've tried to approach this. To the point Jeff made about other models and something that we've been involved in developing is a community investment trust and trying to help communities, neighborhoods get control of land that's abandoned or homes that are vacant or abandoned, so that they can work to either build housing there or use that land for other purposes that'll create an asset for that community or an amenity for that. So that actually is, one thing that we've been really focused on. It's not just providing the capital, but is really how do you engage the community and the neighborhood and empower that neighborhood and build that capacity in that neighborhood so that they can really be very involved and engaged in the process of essentially, rebuilding their community and bringing cohesion back to their community, neighborhoods that have been abandoned or for so long.
Brent, I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the initiatives underway in Kansas City that you've been involved with?
Sure, absolutely. It's just so exciting to hear about all this work in both of our cities. For us, we were very interested in understanding the home buying experience. So I work with a colleague, Jim Delisle, who also works in real estate. And we were very interested in trying to figure out how can you make the decisions that buyers make in buying that house? How do you help them make better decisions? What we're finding with the land bank homes is that families didn't have very good information about what they were buying, and getting trapped into situations that were not good for them as families. And so what we did is we created, I call them a Zillow for ugly houses, and I say that with respect because I understand these are people's homes, or they were at one point. But really, when you buy a land bank house in Kansas City, not to speak of St. Louis, it's kind of a black box. You have you can drive by, you can have a limited half-an-hour slot to walk through the house and put down your offer. And so we built out a website that looks a lot like Zillow, gives you a lot of information about the immediate neighborhood, your neighbors. We use a lot of open public data to understand if there are 311 calls, if there are property violations or building permits being pulled in the immediate area. And the idea is to really help those families have more information about what they're getting into so that they can be much more successful in turning that house around and hopefully living there for a long time.
Nyla, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. What are some ways that your neighborhood is helping to tackle this problem?
Well, one of the things that we did probably about 4 or 5 years ago was become very intentional about understanding the vacant house landscape in our neighborhood. The assumption was that most of them were owned by outside of the area LLCs or companies. But when we did our audits, we found that there were 3 categories. Basically owned either by Land Bank or the Housing Homestead Authority of Kansas City, or they were privately owned. The first 2, what we've done with those is as those homes have gone on the market and someone is interested in selling them, we're being very active with those 2 agencies to review what the prospective buyer is going to do with the house. Do they really have an intention of rehabbing the house, living in the home? And then we track. If it is sold to them, we track. They have 3 years, I believe it is, to actually bring the house up to codes. And we basically track to see if they are doing or have done what they said they were going to do. With respect to the private homes, we were actually surprised when we did our audit that most of the homes are not owned by out of the area LLCs, but rather they're owned by heirs who, for the most part, still live in the area, but they don't want to, for whatever reason, sell the house. And so we've done some things in terms of trying to reach out to those, especially on streets where there are multiple vacant homes, just to get an understanding of why they aren't doing anything with the house. Another thing that we do is we keep abreast of any homes that have vagrancy or anybody illegally occupying the house. And then we make nuisance calls, again, drawing attention to the fact that this is a house that people can access because it's not secured properly. And then the third thing that we do is we strongly work with anybody who's interested in purchasing a house under the Abandoned Housing Act program. They need support from the neighborhood in order to do that. And again, as long as their plan is good and they're not just looking to flip the house, but they are actually going to live in the house, we support them on that effort.
That's great to hear. Ruben, in general, do you think banks are interested in helping these kind of home buyers that Nyla's talking about? And if so, what are some of the programs you've seen that help them and can work? I think you're muted.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, I think generally not enough. I think some programs out there, I think, banks have created kind of down payment assistance programs and, home ownership programs. They've supported nonprofits that are, providing that type of assistance or those resources, but it's not nearly enough. And, when you talk about our financial system and our banking institutions, that they have trillions of dollars in capital that could help support this. It's just, there just needs to be a way to motivate them to deploy that capital where it's needed. But, that's why CDFIs exist. We have great relationships with them. We can partner with them to provide different resources and capital to communities to address the issue.
Neil, I'm curious to hear your perspective. Do you see that same need for banks to step up in St. Louis?
Most definitely. I think we have tried several different components, whether it's a contractor loan fund or even the Gateway Neighborhood Fund that's really focused on addressing any of the appraisal gaps to attract additional investment into many of the low-income areas. And we are working through those tools to provide those resources. But like you said, and like Ruben said, it's not enough. I think we have to go further. We have to go deeper. We have to deepen those relationships with community organizations such as CLACO and SLACO, I'm sorry. And then also working alongside OutCap and LIST and other organizations who are really boots on the ground. I know Justine Peterson does a tremendous job on providing contractors with financial education on the things that are not construction related. Just because you are a carpenter doesn't mean you know accounting. And so they provide those resources, they create that network in order for those skilled laborers and skilled tradesmen to be able to have the necessary resources to turn their talent into a business. And so I think those are some of the resources in which we have to double down on, but also find ways, as Ruben spoke to create access to capital for those rehabbers, but also for home ownership into many of these low-income areas that have depressed market rates, that haven't been able to see that type of investment or aren't attracting homeowners at the same rate as other more thriving neighborhoods. So there's more that we can do. I know we're trying a few things that I mentioned, but I think we need to double down on the things that are working, such as the technical assistance for many of these rehabbers and home ownership opportunities.
And Sarah, if I could just throw in there, I mean, just to kind of piggyback off of what Neil was talking about, we also need just new ways to bring capital to communities. And, if the financial mainstream doesn't see, or traditional financial institutions don't see the potential, we've got to figure out ways that we can use other financing vehicles to support investments in communities and empower residents to essentially use the resources they have to get control of these abandoned properties or these vacant lands. And that's where I think community investment trusts and community land trusts have a lot of potential to really empower communities to take control of this issue.
Peter, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. As sort of, I feel like the legal and the banking end of things, they seem to go hand in hand in the complication part of all this. What are some of the challenges in the work that your agency is doing to help with this?
Yeah, well, I think Neil and Ruben kind of took the words right out of my mouth. I mean, this access to capital is a big bottleneck, and there are programs that work. And I think we've heard already, for the last half hour about these different collaborations and partnerships that do yield results. We need to make sure that we're continuing to support them so that we can replicate the work to scale. I know on our end, when thinking about challenges when it comes to clearing title, whether that's being the carrot and working with families to solve those title issues so that they can get a loan or sell that property, or whether that's being a stick and filing a lawsuit against an absentee property owner. I mean, we're looking at 12,000 vacant properties that are privately owned in the city of St. Louis. It's an enormous problem that has gone on for way too long. And so just the sheer volume, I think, is probably the biggest challenge we face in being able to bring in enough resources to meet that challenge. I just earlier today, about an hour ago, got a phone call from a woman who lives in Walnut Park. She found our website and said, I don't know if you can help me or not, but I'm living in my mom and dad's home, but they've been dead for 10 years. I tried to go to the bank to get a loan to repair it, and they said, I can't because I'm not on title. We get these calls multiple times a week, and we do what we can to solve those issues. Those are solvable problems, but it takes resources to do it. And so that's been the biggest challenge for us, is how do we scale up? How do we scale up these partnerships and these collaborations to really do what needs to be done in St. Louis, and I'm sure in Kansas City as well.
Sunday, I know in your work, you've had some people find real success with rehabbing these homes and getting people living in them. How do you put that experience that they've gained on the ground and help replicate that so that they can build on it and it can multiply itself?
Okay, I am going to go back to that, but I did want to tap on to something Peter said. When you have those problems related to passing on home ownership, homes and things like that, Peter has introduced the beneficiary deed to a lot of our neighborhood residents, particularly our senior citizen population that feel as if they have to have a will drafted and it takes thousands of dollars, when they can reach out to legal services and draft a beneficiary deed to pass on their home to their children. So that helps prevent a problem from arising in the first place. But then also I wanted to speak to some of the financial products that are being created by some of the financial institutions. In St. Louis, we have the Gateway Neighborhood Fund, which is 6 banks coming together to pull, I think right now they're at about 2 million or a little over $2 million, where it's the Detroit model, where you have a first and second mortgage, where the first mortgage pays for acquiring the building and the second mortgage can help pay for the rehab up to $75,000 plus the appraisal price of the home. I just wanted to add that in. But in terms of having great success and putting people's experiences to work and helping others do the same and rehabbing homes, I mentioned earlier the young man, Eltorian Hawkins. Now, he was one of the creators of Finest 15, and he joined SLACO about 5 years ago when he was only 23 years old. And at that time, he had purchased one LRA home and had rehabbed it and moved his mom into it, which I thought was phenomenal. And since then, he's went on to purchase 4 more LRA homes and rehab them, and he rents some and he sold some. So he has taken his experience that he's had and he began to educate others, both young and old, not only through the Finest 15 workshops, but he also does a lot of live streaming that we place on our website and on a Facebook page where people can see the work that's being done. And he also can do one-on-one consultations where he handholds a lot of residents through that process and even walks them through a particular LRA vacant home that they are wanting to purchase. But Eltorian was also instrumental in helping us create with local legislators a new program called Mow to Own. And this is a program where residents may purchase an adjacent vacant lot for $125 with an agreement to mow and maintain that lawn for like 24 months. So he not only helps with helping to educate people, but helping to create new laws and programs and policies to help others attain some of the vacant stock that we have.
Well, this is all just, there's some good news coming out of this big problem. I do want to remind people, if you're listening to this conversation and you find yourself with a question developing, we're going to get to our Q&A portion of this conversation very shortly. We want to encourage you to use the Q&A feature of the webinar there. If you type your question in there, we'll be able to get to that in just a few minutes. Before we get to that section of the conversation, though, I do want to talk about some things that are a little more forward-looking, some efforts that are just getting underway that could reap some big rewards here. And Brent, I want to start with you on this. You have a project that is putting cameras on garbage trucks. Can you tell us what this will do?
Yeah, I'm a strange guy, right? Not many people want to put cameras on a garbage truck, but working with Kansas City, Missouri. And if one theme that I've been picking up today is information is power. And really, this is an effort to empower neighborhoods to understand what's happening in their neighborhood. And so if we think about this, it's a National Science Foundation funded project where we're putting cameras on these garbage trucks because one of the fundamental problems is we don't know how many houses are abandoned in Kansas City. It's a problem that we kind of guess at. And really one of the major challenges is once a house is abandoned, it takes a lot of bring it back. It ways the neighbors, the residents and the like. So our idea is, what if we could identify a house that is 6 months before abandonment? How could we pick up on small, subtle cues in a housing condition to say, boy, maybe that grandmother who owns that home is having trouble with the gutter that just fell down. Or the boy, look at it looks like that roof is leaking over there. These aren't sexy topics, but if you think about leveraging how a garbage truck works, it goes the same route every single week. And what we can do through using our artificial intelligence models is to identify subtle changes in a house. To say, wow, that gutter did fall down this week. And grant, a truly micro grant of $50 to have a neighborhood handyman come put that gutter back up and help that person stay in that house. So we're working with NYLA in the Ivanhoe neighborhood right now. They've been wonderful partners in doing that. And, you know, it's opened up a whole dialogue about how neighborhood associations can really become empowered to make sure that they keep their residents there happy and healthy.
Nyla, I'd love to hear your perspective on this. Is this something that the neighborhood welcomed and was on board for?
Absolutely. We are the curator of strange relationships, especially through universities. Essentially, what we've done is we've opened ourselves up to being able to extend our capacity by working with universities on different projects. So when Brent approached me about the project, I said, of course, because anything that will help us identify what's going on in the neighborhood is great for us. And it also allows me not to have to do everything myself, but have student support, because most of the students involved in the studies are grad students. So I have, I think, about 4 studies going on now currently with UMKC, KU, and Kansas State University. And so that kind of work is instrumental for us. I also wanted to talk about the fact that our residents also are very engaged in understanding and being on top of what's going on in the neighborhood. And that's essentially how we stay on top of everything as an association, is the power of the residents. They know what's happening on their blocks, and in their 2 or 3 block area, know, you know, what's happening and how we can best address it.
So it's really bubbling up from the ground up.
Yes, and it has been for the last 20 years.
Sunday, that's actually a great transition to something that happened in St. Louis that also bubbled from the ground up. And that is a bigger initiative pushed by SLACO. This one involves tax dollars. This could be a pretty big deal. Tell us a bit about Prop NS.
Yes, Proposition Neighborhood Stabilization. Yes, yes, yes. That was a blood, sweat, and tears effort. And that was something we initiated in 2017. It's a $40 million bond issuance, allowing up to $6 million per year to stabilize land bank-owned properties, which are owned by LRA. And it allows $30,000 to be applied to a single family home and $50,000 per multifamily home up to 6 units. And nominations, anyone that pays city property taxes or neighborhood associations and the like, and different organizations can nominate a property to receive these fundings. And the funds can be used for ensuring water tightness related to a new roof, gutters, tuck pointing, etc. And structural stabilization improvements can be done. Boarding up of some of the buildings can also be paid for with these funds, and interior demolition. Now, these homes, they're grandfathered into the original LRA starting bid, which in most cases, in some of our neighborhoods that are heavily concentrated with vacancies, those values range from $1,000 to $4,000. So essentially, a person can purchase one of these homes that has received a $30,000 incentive or a $50,000 incentive for $1,000 to $4,000, which has made it more enticing and inviting, and taken some of the heavy costs, like a new roof sometimes, and the major costs of tuck pointing some of these properties off of the developer or even the resident that is trying to develop those properties, take that burden off of their shoulders. So I'm glad to announce it was blood, sweat, and tears getting it here. And we started that back in 2017, and we collected over 15,000 signatures to get it on the ballot, where we received over 58% of the vote. But we had a slight battle over, is that enough for this? And so we won that battle. And now I'm so happy to announce that Proposition NS, or Prop NS as it's really known, is now a full-fledged city program, and it has stabilized 3 homes so far, and they're working on more right now, but they have up for sale the first 3 homes of the Prop NS program for purchase. And you can Google search Prop NS and the city webpage for the program, and everything should be listed. And any property that is nominated, we were really stringent on transparency for this program. We did not want these funds to be utilized by the city to just go in and invest in what they wanted. We wanted something very transparent. So you can look and see all of the nominated properties and the stage at which they are in, if they're being reviewed, if they're having work done on them, and all of that from the Prop NS website. There's a lot of oversight to this that we as residents had a slight difficulty convincing the city, but they managed to get on board and help us keep it transparent and inclusive with the Civilian Oversight Board.
Boy, I remember some of the battles Sunday is talking about there. The city did not make it easy for SLACO on some of this, and they have prevailed. So it's exciting to hear about this next chapter as we continue to look ahead on some efforts just getting underway or that are still in the realm of being planned. I'd love to hear from a couple of our remaining panelists, and then we'll get to some of your questions. We do have quite a few, which is great. We want to encourage you, if you want to enter those into the Q&A function of this webinar. We'll get to those in just a few minutes. Before we do that though, Neil, what is next up on your agenda in terms of all the work that you're doing on these issues?
Yeah, so thank you again. And this is extremely exciting and been an informative panel discussion for sure. I'm excited to announce our Hyde Park 2025 initiative through Dream Builders for Equity. Over the next 5 years, we plan to invest $5 million in the Hyde Park community located in North St. Louis City. This includes addressing the vacancy in that neighborhood by rehabbing 25 homes for first-time home buyers with over 250 students over the next 5 years. This is also about keeping residents in place by providing major home repairs for 25 elders in that same community. We are also repurposing vacant lots and turning them into community gardens. We're actually building a chess park for the youth to engage in with some of the elders and other people within the community at large. And finally, we are renovating commercial space for community services, including a 24-hour daycare facility that we're providing that was asked for by the community. And so those are some of the exciting things that we have ahead. So over the next 5 years, what we're calling Hyde Park 2025, we hope to transform that community by being focused on addressing vacancy, addressing major home rehabs and repairs that are needed by elders and low-income residents to be used as a model that can be replicated across the St. Louis region and beyond. So I'm excited to make that announcement, and thank you all for the opportunity today.
That is super exciting. Ruben, one last question for you here. You kind of are calling, you have called here in this conversation for banks to step it up a little bit. How are some ways that lenders could aid in all of these efforts that we're talking about today that you'd want to get them thinking about?
Yeah, I think supporting CDFIs and the grassroots work that CDFIs are doing in communities to bring capital and resources to communities to address issues like this, I think that's one way. I think we got a real great potential with the Community Reinvestment Act modernization process that's going on right now, and hopefully getting banks to localize their CRA investments more, again, to address issues like this. From AltCap's perspective, I mean, we want to scale up our home rehabber loan fund, get more small contractors to participate in rehabbing these homes. But then also, I think really promoting and supporting these community land trusts, community investment trusts is something that Equity Squared and Community Capital Fund is going to be very, very involved in. We can absolutely partner with banks to help support those investments. We've got some great organizations that we've been working with here, the Marlboro Community Land Trust. Rebecca McQuinlan has been doing some great things in the Marlboro community, and then David Kemper with Trust Neighborhoods is doing some really great stuff in the Northeast with Community Investment Trust. So we think there's a lot of potential there, and we're gonna be very involved in that.
Peter, last question goes to you before we go into the Q&A portion here. And again, a reminder, you can get those questions in now. We'll hopefully get to a few more here before this conversation ends. Peter, are there any sort of regulatory or legal changes that you would want to advocate for that would help the communities fighting these battles right now?
Yeah, I think in Missouri, we're actually really fortunate. We have a lot of legal tools available to community groups, to residents. We talked about beneficiary deeds, Missouri's Abandoned Housing Act. At the city level, there's municipal receivership, things like that, that are really effective at returning vacant property to productive use. And again, I think those efforts need to be expanded and supported. I think equally as big of a challenge is how do we prevent vacancy from happening in the first place? So how do we make sure that people can access financing to make repairs? How can we make sure that systems like our property tax collection system is equitable so that longtime neighborhood residents don't have to have their homes sold out from under them to some California investor because they can't pay their taxes? So I think in those areas of preventing vacancy, we still have a long way to go and a lot to think about. And I know that's the area where our organization and our partners here in St. Louis is increasingly putting our focus.
Well, how great to hear that for once we can say Missouri has something where we're doing really well. That's a great and surprising thing to hear from Peter. I don't always expect that in my line of work. I want to thank all of our panelists for answering all the questions that I've thrown at them. Now it's time for them to answer some questions that you have. And we've got some great ones here in our Q&A module for this webinar. Feel free to enter more as we go. I think we will have time to get to most of the ones in so far. This first question here is about Kansas City. And boy, I'm trying to decide who I should put this towards. I think I'm going to start with Jeff on this for his thoughts. Jeff, to address all the empty, underdeveloped land here in KC, what are your thoughts on replacing our property tax system with a land value tax? That is, tax the assessed value of a piece of land rather than the value of the buildings that sit on it. And that question comes from David. Jeff, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. What I will say is, I think that my sense on the land value tax, and I may defer to Peter or Brent, on this also, but is that it's generally perceived as a more progressive tax, so that it does address some of the equity issues in the property tax, and it would allow for part of the issue, particularly in Kansas City, we see recently over the last couple of years where huge spikes in property tax values as certain parts of the community get reassessed every few years. It's kind of, there's not a steady increase, but all of a sudden you're assessed here. And it's really hard for residents, long-term residents, as Peter was talking about, to be able to maintain some of their housing. So I think it's worth looking at. One thing I would mention is, part of the issue we face is there's always questions about whether a land value tax can generate enough revenue. Our property taxes are assessed at the county level. The city itself obviously overlaps 4 different counties. And so it becomes somewhat of a challenge sometimes to change some of the policies that are managed at a county level that impact city issues. So I'll defer to my colleagues if they have more.
Yeah, Jeff, thank you for that answer. Brent or Ruben, would either of you like to hop in on this one?
Sure. Well, I'll just say that it is interesting. We've had conversations in the region on this concept, and I have to second Jeff. I'm not sure about the St. Louis situation, but our land values our property taxes have been assessed in kind of a herky-jerky kind of motion, where people will find that their tax bill has gone up by 100%. Sometimes I've heard 300% increases in your tax bill, and that's really troubling for the fabric of a neighborhood. If you think about I always use the grandmother as an example, but I know a lot with whom I work, and they are most at risk of falling to these rapid changes in assessed values of homes. I'm not completely sure that a land-based tax would get us there, but it is a real discussion about how quickly some of our neighborhoods are changing, and that is something that you have to think about. Homestead exemption that you have in other places where you can keep people, particularly on fixed incomes, at a set rate, so their assessed values don't take off on them.
Okay. I've got another Kansas City question here, and I'm not sure who is the best to speak to this. So as I start to read it, if one of you starts to think that might be you, will you please indicate, start waving frantically at me. Can one of the KC representatives speak to this concept of a, quote, community investment trust? Also, can the names of those community investment trusts be listed again? Does anyone feel up for taking this? Ruben, great, thank you.
Yeah, I mentioned it. So a community investment trust is essentially a kind of investment vehicle that allows community residents to kind of pool their money, invest in land or property. Could be residential property, could be commercial property. So that's something that Community Capital Fund and Equity Squared, two of AltCap's affiliates, are really trying to promote and create opportunities for here in Kansas City to use that investment vehicle to allow residents of neighborhoods to kind of be empowered, take control of vacant land or a piece of property that they'd like to see improved, maybe bring in a business that they'd like to see in their neighborhood. So I mentioned Trust Neighborhoods is one group here in Kansas City that David Kemper is leading, that they're working with that model, that community investment trust model. And then Marlboro Community Land Trust is a land trust is very similar to investment trust in that you're again pooling resources of a neighborhood to get control of or to invest or get control of land in that neighborhood to empower that neighborhood to with the development of that land. So
here's another kind of technical question that maybe is also right for Ruben. Sorry to keep putting you on the spot here. Can you explain the difference between a land bank and a land trust? Are you a good guy for that? Yeah, great. Yeah,
I mean, the land bank is a kind of a statutory or city entity that essentially collects abandoned vacant properties through various means. A land trust, that's what I mentioned. Rebecca McQuinlan has created for Marlboro community. That's essentially a community or neighborhood-led initiative and an entity that's created to essentially allow the neighborhood to buy land or property. So it's a little bit different. A land bank is typically, I think, publicly controlled, where a land trust could be privately controlled by a neighborhood.
Brent?
I also, not to sound like a professor, I guess I am, but it's really important to think about the idea that real estate, we always think as a private transaction between a buyer and a seller. When you think of the knock-on costs of a transaction in a neighborhood, the community bears some of those costs, right? So if your grandmother passes away, you sell your family's house to maybe an aggregator of properties that then sells it to a real estate investment trust, the whole community bears the negative aspects that could happen from that. And that's where the idea of a community trust really works, because it's starting to say, we're going to take the benefits of this real estate transaction, and we're going to bear those benefits as a community. It's not a single one-to-one sort of transaction, and that's really important in letting communities leverage these as assets. These homes are assets and really benefit from that transaction.
Yeah, and Brett, even like through a deed, community land trust or community investment trust that controls a piece of property, they can essentially maintain some affordability within that property, that house that was built in that neighborhood through the deed. So that's really a powerful tool for neighborhoods to maintain that affordability and also mitigate any negative impacts of a lot of development happening where you might have people displaced from that neighborhood or community.
We've had a lot of questions targeting Kansas City. Here's one for St. Louis. I'm not sure if it should be Sunday or Peter, but I suspect one of them may have an answer. For the land banks in St. Louis, Alicia wonders, how can elected officials ensure the land bank reduce unused properties every year? Sunday or Peter, do either of you have any thoughts on how elected officials could keep, I imagine they're talking about the Land Utilization Authority, the LRA here, keep getting those properties back into the community? Sunday?
Okay, well, I'll take a stab at it. But in St. Louis, it would be beneficial if legislators rise above any particular feelings of inadequacy of someone to renovate those properties. And it should be somewhat based on the process of having the LRA Commission, which is our land bank commission, determine if the individual, and the staff of LRA determine if that individual is capable of rehabbing that home, and take some of the politics out of that. That could help ensure that we have more individuals successfully acquiring these properties and rehabbing them. And the other thing that legislators could do is work with organizations such as ours, such as legal services, to help create policies and to increase financial resources and investment towards helping individuals that are on that path to rehabbing a home or just need to repair their existing home that they live in. Help organizations like Legal Services or the Vacancy Collaborative and SLACO with neighborhood associations to put a charge under our financial institutions to be more equitable in its lending and disbursement of resources.
Okay. Thank you for that, Sunday.
If I could just add just another thought there. I mean, we've got to, as Sunday said, we've got to set people up to succeed and not set people up to fail. And one of the things, I did very similar work in Kansas City with legal aid for many years before moving back to St. Louis. And one of the differences I really found in doing this work is the housing stock in St. Louis is significantly older. It's significantly more expensive to rehabilitate. So it makes it that much harder for the LRA or the city's land bank here to find a qualified buyer. So that access to capital is really a big issue. The other issue we have really relates to how the LRA acquires title. It acquires title through the tax foreclosure process. And if that tax foreclosure process doesn't give notice to everybody who has an interest in that property as it moves through the system, the LRA kind of gets stuck with a property that they can't sell for full value, or the buyer can't get a loan because of those title issues. So there are some state legislation changes, I think, that are being proposed by the Vacancy Collaborative and others that would hopefully clean up some of that tax foreclosure title blight that we see that really, I think in some ways sets people up not to succeed. And if we can set them up with access to capital and a clear title, I think it's going to increase the likelihood that more people are going to succeed when buying and rehabbing those LRA properties.
Thank you for that perspective, Peter. Here's a question that relates to Neil's organization, but I'm not sure if Neil would be the right person to answer it. We'll maybe start with him. He asks, is there a Kansas City program comparable to St. Louis's Dream Homes for Equity program that's for first-time home buyers? Neil, do you have a Kansas City equivalent?
Not that I know of, and I wish I did. I would love to learn from them about things that are working and not working as we begin to scale our program. But one of the things that we are doing is building some networks across many different communities and regions. So I would love to find ways to connect with people in Kansas City that are on the ground that have some of these issues, and to be able to share some of our learnings and our programming with them to be able to replicate this model in Kansas City. But I don't know if any of my Kansas City family here has any other ideas or organizations that are doing similar work.
Yeah, would anyone point to anything that's similar to what Neil's doing? Neil, you seem like you're a unicorn. There's only one of you. Unfortunately for our questioner. I'm going to direct this next question to Nyla. Alicia is wondering, how can community leaders get involved? I'm very interested, Nyla. It seems like your neighborhood, like there's such power there, and you bring such a presence to the table for people who want to work on these initiatives. What advice would you have for people who want to replicate what your neighborhood is in the process of developing?
Well, the first thing that I would say is to start in your neighborhood and to find people who are like-minded, who are serious about making an impact in the neighborhood. Because the problems are all over Kansas City. It's not just in Ivanhoe. It's not just in the 3rd district. It's in a significant portion of Kansas City. And then I would advise to start asking questions of anybody who has anything to do with housing or neighborhood development. Most neighborhoods have a neighborhood association. So, that's where you would start based on where you live. But again, be ready to learn, because there's a lot to learn. We've been at this now for 21, 22 years. The success that Ivanhoe is having, it has been a long trajectory. Everybody just sees the end result and thinks that, it just happened overnight, and it did not. So that's the advice that I would give. And then I would also say, pick a project that you can start and initiate, because I think once you have something very concrete to address, then you can get more people to the table to help, and you can also find the resources. I'm gonna put Brent on the or UMKC sort of on the hot spot. Reach out to the universities. Most of the departments are looking for a real life project to engage the students in. And Brent can speak more to that. So,
Brent, would you echo that people should reach out to the universities here?
Absolutely. I mean, between UMSL and UMKC, as well as other higher ed institutions, I think we have a strong commitment to, sorry, my dog, you can tell it's almost 5 p.m. My dog is chewing on my leg, but regardless, it's something we do, and it's something that we also want to get our students to do. This is real life learning in the complexity of the world. We don't want textbook examples. Textbooks are boring and don't set our students up to succeed. And we have labor, whether it's maybe not swinging a hammer, but certainly when it comes to thinking through these issues of how to help neighbors knit their community, back together.
Here's a question that came in from Candy. She asks, what about equity? St. Louis's North Side has been so intentionally disinvested by unofficial Team 4 plan, et cetera, and money or resources still go disproportionately or sometimes unfairly proportionately to the South Side. Financing, HUD money, newer garbage trucks, foundation funding, et cetera. How can we get the entire area to intentionally invest where it is needed most into housing and commercial properties on the North Side? For example, says Candy, the Ville area was a fine historic Black neighborhood. We need equity of all types to revitalize. Sunday, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Thank you. And thank you, Candy, for posing that question. Equity is at the core of what our problem is right now. And we've always said we have equal distribution, but at a point where everything has been totally decimated in certain communities, what is equality anymore? It does not exist. So we definitely need equity at the table. And it starts with our leadership. As residents, we have to start electing those officials that believe in equity, and not only believe in it, but have the guts to stand up to those financial institutions, the policymakers, to be more equitable, we also have to look at what our economic leaders are doing. And in St. Louis, we have this new approach, this greater St. Louis region approach that has come together. Some of our like civic progress, some of the economic engines of St. Louis, the powers that be, some of the wealthiest are sitting on these groups, right? That determine how we go and flow. They have to have a fire lit under them to understand that equity is at the core of anything, and that we as residents will distrust, or me personally, let me just speak for me personally, I almost distrust any plan that says we're going to start with the central corridor and build from there, as if anything happening either downtown or in the central corridor will trickle over to North St. Louis, or even South St. Louis for that matter. Anyone that starts with a plan like that greatly concerns me, and we need strategic, targeted funds directed at those areas that have been denied investment for years. And that's what I'd like to see. So equity is at the core of everything we should do, and we as residents need to step up to the plate and elect those officials that people that we elect need to believe equity should be at the table, and insist on those leaders that are currently serving as economic leaders of our community put equity first, and no longer this trickle down and trickle over approach.
Sunday, this next question, it comes from Ryan, and it kind of dovetails on what you were speaking to there. He wants to know, for St. Louis, what impact does the city-county divide have on your work? I'm curious, as we talk about these neighborhood issues, whether that's a factor. And after we hear from you, I think I'd love to hear from Neil on this as well.
Yeah, and I would even like to include Peter in this one too, if that's okay, Sarah, because he knows a lot of the laws, the different laws that exist for the city and the county. But that type of divide, I think, has definitely slowed us down and made us less progressive, I personally believe, as a city. And we do need to do more, that we connect together as a region to solve some of our problems, because the problems I have here, I used to think I live in one of the hardest hit, I live in Walnut Park, which is one of the hardest hit neighborhoods with vacancy and crime. And at 70 and West Florissant, when there was a first gun shooting, I was like, oh my goodness. And I'm begging for help, calling the Missouri Department of Transportation and the Highway Department and all of that, trying to sound an alarm, because that is very problematic to have that. That stops people from getting on the highway, period. Now it has expanded, and it's also in the city and the county. It's almost like across the region. Now every single highway within our region has had some type of gun violence on it. And that is greatly concerning. So we need to start working together. All of those divides that we have between what is city and what is county, we need to start coming together and creating a more uniform approach on how we deal with these things. And I want to turn it over. Who did you say to Neil or to Peter? Which one?
I was curious if Neil had thoughts.
Yeah, I definitely had thoughts, just not on the city-county divide, but also what Cindy spoke to at first regarding the equity piece component of that. I think in the city of St. Louis, we've provided the majority of the tax incentives and tax abatement shifts to the central corridor, instead of looking at how do we provide that through an equitable lens. Because some of the incentives that we provided to those central corridors, those more affluent areas that don't necessarily need it as a subsidy, ultimately have a negative impact on the tax rolls and the budget of our city government, that are able to provide resources to the communities that were not able to benefit from some of those tax abatements and tax incentives. So as we're thinking about equity, if we're providing an equity lens to the ways in which we're allocating these tax incentives and other resources for economic development, we want to make sure we understand also the unintentional consequences that create in North City communities, because ultimately that impacts the public safety, that impacts the school system, that impacts the educational outcomes and overall quality of life for those residents that live in North City that did not get the benefit of some of those tax incentives that were provided. And like Cindy said, this is a regional issue, because if we don't have jobs, if we don't have educational resources to create a thriving environment, we can attract the necessary employers and corporations to our region to provide the thriving areas that we hope to be able to provide for our future communities.
Peter, I saw you nodding to that. Was there anything you'd want to add to what Sunday and Neil shared?
No, I think they both summed it up really well. It's a regional problem. We need regional solutions.
Okay. Here's one, another question that may just have a quick answer if no one knows the answer, but I figured it was worth posing to try to get an answer for Alicia. She wonders, what are the plans for creating a rating system for developers and contractors? Is this something any of our panelists know about? It's not ringing a bell for me. Okay, those are not plans that we are familiar with. This might well be our last question. I'm not sure, but I want to address this at first to Nyla, and then I'd also love to hear the St. Louis answer to this. Nyla, with a lack of funds for rent and for repairs as a main reason for vacancy, does unemployment due to the pandemic create a major setback to all these great efforts? That's a great question that comes in from Linda. How do you see the impact of the economic crisis that we're in affecting all the work you're doing and that's underway on these issues?
So far, it has not impacted our work. And I think it has actually funneled more money into the Community Development Block Grant, which allows us to do minor home repair and other things because of COVID. Like there is a RFP that is due on the 22nd of this month, specifically around COVID funding for housing and wraparound services. So far it has not. And I think part of that might be because the millions of evictions, I don't really think have hit the street yet.
There's still a moratorium. Yeah.
Exactly. So in 6 months, I may have a totally different answer.
Okay. But for now, things look okay.
Yes. For now, things are holding steady for us.
That is great to hear from Kansas City on the St. Louis part. Or Jeff, did you want to chime in on Kansas City?
Well, the only thing I would add to that, I agree with Nyla. I think that we haven't seen the full force of potential evictions. You know, in Kansas City, we have roughly $300 million every month go to rental payments. And so we certainly have seen evictions continue in some limited circumstances, as we've heard from partners. You know, but the national government needs to take an approach that helps kind of the whole ecosystem, the renter and the landlords, to be able to, pay their mortgages as well. And we haven't seen kind of a comprehensive approach yet taken. And that's something that we're hopeful as we think about how do we avoid vacancies, how do we avoid abandoned properties. Part of that is keeping people in their homes, keeping them in their housing going forward.
Would anyone from the St. Louis side like to speak to that question? How are we doing today, and do we worry about the near future? Sunday.
Hi, thank you, Sarah. I wanted to speak about that in terms of the pandemic. So what the pandemic has taught us as a collaborative, I tell everyone it has made us tattered, but we are triumphant because we still managed to, thanks to Zoom, we still managed to do a lot of great things and host our meetings and keep everyone included and informed and get a lot of feedback. But the pandemic has really taught us the loss of employment and eviction notices that went out. And I'm grateful for the moratoriums, but we needed to start tracking some of our eviction data. So now we have a gallant effort afoot with legal services helping us at trying to look at eviction data and trying to help people before they even have to go to court with certain problems. And we're even looking at right now a data tool, an app for tenants to utilize to, if they need help, they can just go to this app, put in some of their concerns. We're trying to figure out how to staff that, how to maintain it, and all of that. And then the other piece that we're critically looking at now is the home repair. We do not want any more vacancies due to individuals not being able to repair their home. And some of them have major home repair needs, such as a new roof and those types of things. And we're looking at reestablishing the home repair network because we have a lot of home repair organizations out here. However, they're on different pages. And when you're looking for home repair assistance, you don't necessarily know which organization is the right one to go to. Some do minor repairs only, some do both, some have limited funds. And we're noticing that each one has a huge waiting list. And that doesn't help. And then some of them have income guidelines where if someone is just $10 over income, they could end up losing their home. So we're trying to find a way to create a network, number one, but also a home repair fund that can help individuals that just don't meet those guidelines and cannot remain on a waiting list for a couple of years before their home receives the repair that it needs. But those are the things this pandemic has forced us to look at: the eviction data and those individuals that have lost their jobs and cannot afford to repair their homes. Thank you.
Peter, anything you'd want to chime in on when it comes to the impact of this pandemic on all these efforts we've been talking about today?
Yeah, I mean, I think others are right. I feel like I'm on the Titanic heading for the iceberg, or maybe the other way around. I'm not sure, but the moratorium is keeping people in their homes for now. But we know this debt is piling up. And what I'm most worried about, trying not to end on a sour note, but what I'm most worried about is, the last economic recession was different. I mean, it was related to housing. We saw the number of vacant abandoned properties, at least in Kansas City at that time, I think almost double. Banks didn't want to assume title to these properties, so they just abandoned them. What's different now is there are these systems in place where, these mega corporations and Wall Street investors have really figured out how to take advantage of the tax foreclosure system, that debt that exists, to acquire property. And what I think we should be really cautious about is this transfer of wealth from local mom and pop rehabbers, local mom and pop landlords, local homeowners, to increasingly large and difficult to hold accountable coastal or increasingly out of the country corporations. And I think that that's an issue that we need to really monitor closely, but also think critically about ways we can help kind of keep some of that wealth in our own community, so that it's not all just transferred out to the coast into these mega sort of sophisticated investment entities. So that's something that I think makes me particularly nervous about what's going to happen in the years ahead, not just the evictions, but the debt, and then what happens after that. So that's what I would add.
Well, that is a cautionary note to end on, indeed, but I think it's an important one. And it's man, you got to just stay one step ahead of this stuff, as I know everyone on this panel knows. We want to thank all of you for joining us today at this latest installment of the UniverCities Exchange. I don't know about you, but I feel like I learned so much from the people on this panel, and listening to them, their ideas ping pong off each other, and hear about the differences between the cities, the points of commonalities between the cities. It's just been a great discussion. So we do want to thank everybody who was able to join us and share their insights. We want to note that the organizers plan to reach out with a post-event survey and a recording of today's session. And that survey will give you the option to opt in to notifications about future UniverCities events. And we hope we will see you at those. So thank you very much. And I hope everybody enjoys this very cold day and this conversation. Thank you.